Okay, so the appendicular skeletal muscles list the muscles that move the forearm and the hand that act on the elbow joint. All right, so we're now in the second panel of our list. We're thinking about muscles that move the forearm on the hand and the hand. We managed to get through so far the pectoral girdle and the muscles that move the arm. We're moving on to muscles that move the forearm and the hand. We're going to study muscles that act on the elbow joint. The muscles that flex and extend the elbow joint originate on the humerus and insert either on the radius or the ulna. There are two exceptions. As we already learned, the bicep brachii long and short heads originate on the scapula, and the tricep long head originates on the scapula. All right. So the flexors of the elbow joint are anterior and the extensors of the elbow joint are posterior. Remember, the elbow joint doesn't have anything like the mobility of the glenohumeral joint. Okay, it's just a simple hinge joint. All it can do is flex and extend. So the flexors are anterior and the extensors are posterior. No surprise, because we just talked about how muscles that have an anterior insertion can flex the glenohumeral joint, and now we're going to about how muscles that have an anterior insertion can flex the elbow joint. All right, so the three flexors are the bicep brachii, the brachialis, and the brachioradialis, and the two extensors are the tricep brachii and the anconeus. So let's start with the bicep brachii, our first flexor of the elbow joint. The origin of the short head is the scapula, the coracoid process. The origin of the long head is the scapula, the supraglenoid tubercle. The insertion is the radial tuberosity of the radius. The action is flexion of the elbow joint and lateral rotation of the radius at the radio-ulnar joint, causing supination of the forearm and hand. The secondary action is flexion of the glenohumeral joint, and we already went over that. So I think that the bicep brachii is a pretty straightforward muscle. The brachialis has an origin on the anterior humerus. The insertion is on the ulna, the coronoid process. The action is flexion of the elbow joint. It is a synergist to the bicep brachii. The brachialis is deep to the bicep brachii and the brachioradialis, and you'll be able to see this on the arm model. The brachioradialis originates on the lateral humerus. It inserts on the lateral radius way down at the distal epiphysis of the radius at the styloid process, which is just a little projection way down in the distal epiphysis of the radius. The action is flexion of the elbow joint. It is a synergist to the bicep brachii. The brachioradialis originates and inserts distal to the brachialis. It lies predominantly over the radius, and it forms the lateral curve of the forearm. So if you hold your arm in anatomical position and you look at the outer curve of the forearm, you're looking at the brachioradialis. And now this slide shows the picture from Martini's that shows you the flexors of the elbow joint. The bicep brachii is kind of like the star. It's superficial. When people make a muscle, they show off their bicep brachii. Then there's the brachioradialis, primarily lying over the radius. And just peeping out is the brachialis, which is deep to the bicep brachii and the brachioradialis. Okay, moving on to the extensors of the elbow joint found on the posterior of the body. The tricep brachii with its three heads, the long head with the origin on the scapula, in particular the infraglenoid tubercle, the lateral head originating on the lateral humerus, and the medial head originating on the medial humerus, all three heads inserting on the ulna, the olecranon. The action is extension of the elbow joint. We already talked about the long head having a secondary action of extension and adduction of the shoulder joint. The anconeus is a tiny short muscle that runs sort of across the elbow joint, quite close to the elbow joint. The origin is on the humerus, the posterior lateral humerus. The insertion is on the ulna, the olecranon, and the action is extension of the elbow joint. So you can, on your own self, find your posterior lateral humerus and your olecranon, which is the point of your elbow. And then imagine that this little short muscle, when it contracts and shortens, is helping the tricep perform extension of the elbow joint. So this is a synergist to the triceps brachii. Okay, and here's pictures from Martini's. It's a posterior view, and it lets you look at the tricep brachii. The long head pretty much covers up the underlying lateral and medial heads, but all three then get together and insert on the olecranon. And also you can see in this picture the anconeus. Okay, sort of a little tiny strap just below the insertion of the tricep brachii. Okay, so you can pick those out here. And here's a table from Martini's. And then moving on to muscles that move the forearm and the hand, pronators and supinators. So we're moving on down our list. We're still in the forearm and hand group, but we've covered the flexors and extensors of the elbow joint, and now we're moving on to the pronators and supinators of the radio-ulnar joint for pronation and supination of the forearm and hand. Okay, so the three muscles that are pronators or supinators originate on the humerus and the ulna and insert on the radius. This makes sense as it is the radius that is being moved. All of these muscles are acting on the radio-ulnar joint, or we can think of it as they are causing the radius bone to laterally rotate and medially rotate. So in case you've forgotten what the heck is pronation, the radius rotates medially over the ulna at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints. Supination, the radius rotates laterally over the ulna at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints. So here's our list: the pronator teres, the pronator quadratus, and the supinator. Let's start with the pronator teres. It has an origin on the humerus, the medial epicondyle, and medial ulna. The insertion is the lateral radius. The action is medial rotation of the radius at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints for pronation of the forearm and hand. The secondary action is actually flexion of the elbow joint. So the picture here is an anterior view of the right arm. Since you can't see the hand, let me just be very explicit about what this is a picture of. Okay, so I chose this picture because you can really clearly see that there are two origins, one on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and one on the medial ulna, and then both of them go to the lateral radius. So you can imagine that the action is medial rotation of the radius and flexion of the elbow joint. So the next muscle is the pronator quadratus. The origin is the distal ulna. The insertion is the distal radius. The action is medial rotation of the radius at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints for pronation of the forearm and hand. And this is a really easy one to understand. It looks like one of those little wristbands that you see tennis players wear, or that sometimes people wear little wristbands when they're nauseous, like they wear little wristbands on their wrist. And here it is, just lying across the wrist, the anterior wrist. It does not cross the elbow joint, so therefore it has no action on the elbow joint. It just has an action on the radius. Okay, and then our one supinator, called the supinator muscle. The origin is the lateral humerus and posterior ulna. The insertion is the radius and the anterior lateral radius. And the action is lateral rotation of the radius at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints for supination of the forearm and hand. Remember, the bicep brachii also performs supination, remember, of the forearm and hand. So you might say, well, why is there only one supinator? Well, actually, the bicep brachii also has one of its primary actions is lateral rotation of the radius at the radio-ulnar joint. So the supinator muscle is not the only muscle that's helping with supination. Look at these two pictures carefully There's an anterior view of the right arm and a posterior view of the right arm. And it's a bit difficult to see the origins, even in the best picture I could find, which is the posterior view of the right arm to the right of the slide. But then the muscle sort of wraps around and inserts on the anterolateral radius, which is the insertion's better seen in the anterior view of the right arm. But you have to look at both to imagine how this muscle is sort of wrapped around the radius, and when it contracts, it's causing lateral rotation of the radius. Okay, here's the tables from Martini's to help you learn these muscles. And now we're going to move on